So yes, without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you here and to introduce Paul Barclay, who is a Walkley Award-winning writer, journalist and broadcaster and the producer of one of Australia's most popular radio shows, one of the most downloaded podcasts from ABC Radio National, Big Ideas. The ABC is a vital part of Australia's cultural life, and to be honest, I personally consider any major cuts to the ABC's funding as an act of cultural terrorism. We are lucky that ABC Big Ideas is still with us, and tonight's Zoom event is being recorded for that show. So please welcome Paul Barclay.
Thanks, Chrissy. It's great to be here again on Zoom for another Avid Reader virtual event. We had a great chat with Billy Bragg just recently, and I'm really looking forward to this one with writer and academic Clive Hamilton. A lot of water has passed under the bridge since 2018 when Clive published his book Silent Invasion about China's influence in Australia. That book, you might recall, was dumped by its original publisher, Clive believes, because they feared a backlash from Beijing. He found another publisher. The book was published and went on to spark a heated conversation about our reliance on China and the extent of Chinese influence in Australia. In the last few months, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has debilitated the world, triggering a deterioration in relations between China and Australia, and indeed much of the West. China has ramped up its anti-Australian rhetoric following our insistence on an independent investigation into the origin of COVID-19. Many Chinese students have returned home, depriving cash-strapped Australian universities of vital revenue. There's been a trade dispute around a ban on beef exports to China, an increased tariff on barley, recently accusations of cyber attacks by China on Australia, all of which is to say that Clive's follow-up to Silent Invasion, Hidden Hand, there it is, has been released at a rather opportune time. He's co-authored the book with Marieke Olberg, and it takes a global view of how China's Communist Party is influencing everything from politics, business, universities, the media, and other institutions around the world. Essentially, they argue that China's ruling party, the authoritarian CCP, is engaged in an ideological struggle with the West, a Cold War, if you like. Clive's never been afraid of speaking his mind about matters he believes to be of urgent importance, and he joins us tonight to chat about Hidden Hand. Welcome to the program, Clive.
Thanks, Paul. Terrific to be here.
So, Clive, as I mentioned, your previous book had a publisher who refused to publish it. Now with this book, you face a situation where a businessman called Stephen Perry and a group called the 48 Group Club have legally challenged the publication of the book in Canada, the US and the UK. What's going on here?
Well, as you say, the publication of the book in the Northern Hemisphere, in the English-speaking Northern Hemisphere, I should say, it was published in Germany a month ago, was instantly a bestseller, has been held up because one of the British groups mentioned in the book, the 48 Group Club, which we claim is in the book with a mass of evidence that is used by the Chinese Communist Party to exert influence over British elites. That club and its chairman have sent a legal threat to the publisher in Britain, One World, publisher also in the US and licensed to Canada, saying that our client has been defamed and you must make changes and you cannot publish until those changes are made. We've written a very detailed rebuttal. We don't believe that the book is defamatory, well, in the sense that all of the claims in it are true and defensible, and in fact there's a lot more that could have been said, and we have indicated that. So we don't expect that this legal challenge will hold up release of the book.
Are you able to tell us exactly what it is that they claim is defamatory about the book?
Well, there are 9 claims made in the letter from their lawyers. It's probably prudent if I don't go into details. I don't want to stir the pot unnecessarily in the Northern Hemisphere. But essentially, Marieke Olberg and I provided a very detailed account of the history and operation of this organisation and the way in which it has an extraordinary network into the top political and business and academic elites in the United Kingdom and the top political elites in China. So we argue that it's a very important network for the CCP to exert its influence in the UK.
And Stephen Perry, one of the plaintiffs taking this action, is himself a very wealthy pro-China businessman, I understand.
I don't know how wealthy he is, but what's fascinating about it is we delved, actually by going to some fairly obscure books in the National Library of Australia here in Canberra, we delved into the deep history of the 48 Group Club, and it derived its name from a visit by 48 British businessmen to China in 1953, which was an attempt to break the trade embargo on China that had been imposed on the Soviet Union and China by the West. And it was suggested to the leader of this delegation, whose name was Jack Perry, the father of Stephen Perry, that he go back to Britain and set up an organisation that could promote closer Britain-China links. And it turned out that Zhou Enlai, who made this suggestion, is kind of revered in China as the founder of China's intelligence service. And the organisation that the 48 Group Club formed links with, and still has strong links with today, the CCPIT is a Communist Party front group, and the three business people who led the delegation in 1953 and then set up the 48 Group Club in 1954, each of them were secret members of the Communist Party of Great Britain. So it has a really fascinating history, and it's really intriguing to track its history back and then to trace it right up to the current day where, for example, on the 65th anniversary of the foundation of the 48 Group Club, in Beijing there was a grand banquet attended by the nobility of the Chinese Communist Party, which I think was a measure of the importance that the party attaches to the club.
Before we get into the thesis of the book, with your previous book, Clive, you did face some accusations of being xenophobic. There was even some suggested implicit racism, according to some people, about silent invasion. Now, look, I know you reject all of this, and from the outset of Hidden Hand, you draw a distinction between China and the Chinese people, who you have no quibble with, and the Chinese Communist Party itself, which is really essentially the organ with which you take dispute. This distinction is an important one to you, isn't it?
Oh, it's absolutely fundamental. I made the distinction clearly in Silent Invasion, and we make it very clear in Hidden Hand. I mean, Marika Ohlberg and I are very much of the left, and we have a pretty solid history of anti-racism in our political backgrounds. I mean, she is much younger than I am, but she's a very solid defender of human rights and anti-racism and so on. So it's kind of absurd. And people who make this accusation actually fall for the CCP trick of conflating the party with the people. But in fact, all kinds of Chinese people, including plenty of Chinese Australians, are very strong supporters of Silent Invasion. In fact, it was a group of Chinese Australians in Sydney who launched the book. And then about 12 months later, a group of Chinese Australians were very pleased to launch the Chinese language edition of the book, a translation and publication that was carried out eagerly by a publisher in Taiwan. And so I might just point out too that the Silent Invasion was published a month ago in Japanese. Took a long time for various complicated reasons, but was an instant bestseller. I mean, a huge bestseller. When I go to and visit Asia, Taiwan, and so on, or talk to people from Japan or wherever, and say, oh yeah, people say this book is, racist. They're mystified. I mean, they just don't get it. This is an Australian thing. This is all about our cultural history, and what I call xenophobia, the terror, particularly on people on the left, of being accused of racism, so much so that they're afraid to call out this totalitarian, militaristic regime that is interfering in the politics of other countries and threatening people all over the place.
So, Clive, your book opens up with you saying that China's Communist Party has a Cold War mentality in its rhetoric and its actions. So, 30 years after the Cold War with the Soviet Union ended, we have another Cold War of sorts between China and the West. How so? How is this a Cold War? What are you referring to?
Well, there's an enormous amount of debate in US policy circles about, are we in a new Cold War? I tell you the truth, both Marika and I are a little bit impatient with that. And what we point out, and I should say that this is particularly Marika's work, she is an expert, global expert in CCP's external propaganda system. If you read the internal documents of the party theorists and also the internal speeches of party leaders in China, they make it extremely clear over and over again that they believe that China is engaged in a struggle to the death ideologically with the West. And there's one fascinating thing about the Chinese Communist Party, which I didn't realize in my earlier work, and that is just how much emphasis they place on ideas. They believe that fundamentally, whatever military power and economic power you might have, in the end, this is a battle of ideas. And that's why the CCP, even more so under Xi Jinping since the end of 2012, has placed such massive emphasis on what they refer to as discourse power or exerting discourse control. And this is a very big theme that runs right through the book. And in fact, I was kind of surprised as I did the research and worked with Marika just how powerful it emerged as a theme. The way in which the Chinese Communist Party is determined and has devoted massive resources to doing this, to win the discourse battle. In other words, for the rest of the world, including the West, to accept the Chinese Communist Party's perception of China, the party, and its place in the world.
Yes, we'll come to this because it's a particularly important part of their Belt and Road initiative, which we'll talk about. Just coming back, though, to the Cold War, what then is China's agenda if this is a Cold War? I mean, we know that the Soviet Union back in the day was aggressively expansionist and monolithic. What's the end game for China? I mean, they want to, I would imagine, become the major economic power in the world. But do the ambitions of the CCP extend beyond just ensuring that they continue to hold power in China? Do they have expansionist ambitions, would you say?
Certainly. The CCP, particularly under the kind of new cohort of hawks that have taken over the party, and whom President Xi, or we should say Secretary General Xi, has promoted into all of the senior positions in the military and so on, they believe that China should and will become the number one hegemonic power in the world. They say that in their party documents and speeches. They pretend otherwise. They talk about a multipolar world, but they don't really think that. They want a unipolar world. And there's a decision was made some time ago that the way not to do this is the US way, which the US practiced since the end of the Second World War, and that was by an enormous expansion of military power and, if necessary, military intervention. They basically see that as a mug's game. That does not mean that they haven't spent massive resources building up China's military. They certainly do want to dominate and have taken many measures to ensure they want to dominate the Indo-Pacific, which they see as their their sphere of influence, which is why they've devoted so much emphasis to trying to influence Australia. But if you look at what they've done in the South China Sea, what they're trying to do, and to some extent succeeding in the Pacific Islands, the extension of influence, the search for a naval base, the first thing they want to do is push the US out of this region, and that will be their kind of starting point for becoming the globally dominant power.
You say that the CCP, in fact, uses Western democracy to help subvert that democracy. Can you explain how it does that?
Yeah, this is the kind of brilliance of the tactic. I mean, CCP will avoid kinetic warfare as much as it possibly can, perhaps with the exception of Taiwan. We might get to that. That's very, very worrying. But what they do is they pursue political warfare, which is really eroding the resistance of your enemy from within. In other words, take away their desire to resist creeping CCP, Chinese domination under the CCP. And so that's really what the book is about, the way in which China under the CCP, with its massive economic, technological power, extends its influence in a whole range of ways through politics and business and academia. And for me, one of the most fascinating chapters to draft was a later one on culture. And you think, well, why would they bother? But what you see is just the extraordinary extent of the campaign of influence. So cultural institutions, I mean, we're not talking just in China, of course, because all cultural institutions are completely dominated by the party, but in the West, the way in which alliances are formed with the big ballet companies of the West and the opera houses and the theatre companies and so on. There's a real serious program of extending influence into the cultural elites of the West as a way of essentially neutralizing and turning them, or even better, turning them into friends of China. So this is part of a grand program of political warfare or hybrid warfare, where you mobilize and exploit the institutions of democracy, like a free media, like a free market, like the ability to mix and do deals with people, engage in people-to-people exchanges. I mean, that's a very interesting phrase, actually, because it's one constantly used by the Chinese government to promote sister city relationships, for example. But there are no people in China under the CCP, in the sense that there's an independent civil society that's capable, if a city so chooses, to enter into a sister city relationship with Wagga or Sydney or whatever. It's all handled, organised and controlled by the party. So there are no people in China in that sense.
Tell us about the Belt and Road Initiative of China. Some people will be aware of this. This is a way in which China bankrolls infrastructure and investment, often in countries around the world where they don't have the money internally, although not always. China is forging ahead with the relationship with Victoria that perhaps we'll talk about in a moment. But this is a way, you say, of China gaining influence by inserting itself into these countries by investing in it.
Yes, the money leads the way. The money is the promise. The money opens the doors. And ostensibly, if you see what the party says in its propaganda and the way in which it's mostly been reported in the Western media, the Belt and Road Initiative is a way in which China is using its vast reserves of cash to enhance global connectivity through building trade links and investing in infrastructure, ports, airports, roads, and railways, and so on. They love ports and roads and railways. And there's obviously big strategic issues there, as we saw with the Port of Darwin, for instance. But anyway, but if you read, and this is the beauty of working with a sinologist like Marika Olberg, plus the people here in Australia who help me, because I don't speak Chinese and you need Chinese and the capacity to research in China. So I've got some people who brilliant helpers, well, not just helpers, researchers who work with me. What you start to realise is that the way we talk about the Belt and Road, Daniel Andrews, for example, and the way the Chinese Communist Party leaders and the theorists talk about it, writing in the theoretical journals and the party newspapers and so on, it's completely different. I mean, they talk about the Belt and Road in completely different terms. And one of the ways in which they talk about the Belt and Road Agreement is how the BRI is fundamentally a means of extending the CCP's viewpoint through the world. And so this is extremely interesting when you start to forget about the trade and investment for a moment. And if you look underneath at what's going on, and when I say that, underneath means if you look at a Belt and Road Agreement like Victoria's or Italy's, for instance, and we might come back to Italy and its role in breaking up the EU, you see that there are all these kind of auxiliary, soft, irrelevant clauses that no one really takes any notice of. But there are a whole bunch of subsidiary agreements beyond the trade and investment ones in these documents. And they talk about things like media cooperation, cultural exchanges, people-to-people exchanges like sister city agreements. All of these are, and there are organisations like the Silk Road League of Theatres, the Silk Road Think Tank Network, Silk Road University Network. And you think, actually, this is what it's really all about. It's about discourse control. It's about promoting through these unexpected means a CCP worldview which persuades those who kind of sign up to these exchanges and these deals to start thinking in the way the party wants them to. And the way, when you are alert to this, you start to notice that people like Daniel Andrews and the Prime Minister of Italy, after they signed up, they start parroting CCP phrases. It's really quite extraordinary. And those phrases represent how your brain has been rewired to think.
So they become, in a sense, agents of Chinese propaganda, is what you're suggesting. Unwittingly.
And they'd be extremely offended if you suggest this. They are indeed.
But on the other hand, Clive, I mean, cultural exchange per se is not a bad thing. In fact, surely understanding more about China, understanding more about the Asian region at this particular moment in history where, we're in the midst of the Asian century, that is a good thing. So where does one draw the line here?
Well, absolutely. And of course, Chinese Australians who began arriving in this country in around about the 1840s have made an enormous contribution to the cultural diversity and richness of this country. But about 20 years ago, something different started to happen. And that was the CCP decided, rather than ignore overseas Chinese people who had kind of been regarded as not traitors, but who had kind of not really expressed full faith in the motherland. They decided, well, actually, no, these people are a fantastic resource potentially. And so what they did was that they started to devote a great deal of attention and in some cases money to reorienting and building up the process of cultural exchange with nations like Australia and the United States and everywhere, really, because they saw these cultural exchanges as a way of advancing not just the CCP view of the world, but also a way of extending their networks into elites in other nations, and the CCP, in a way, doesn't really care much about the masses. They care about elites. That's where the power lies. So that's who they target. And that's why the Confucius Institutes are such an issue. They're not like Goethe Institutes or Alliance Française. They are agencies controlled by the party that have a political agenda beneath their ostensible goal of promoting Chinese language and culture.
So, in terms of the Victorian agreement between the state government of Victoria and China, the sort of Victorian Belt and Road Initiative, if you like, the exact details of that are not known. Is that right? What do we know about it, and what are your specific concerns about that arrangement?
Well, we don't know we haven't seen all of the documents, I believe, that have been signed on behalf of the people of Victoria, but some have emerged. And, you know, to the uninitiated, they look kind of benign, kind of milquetoast general agreements. But when you start to have a better understanding of how the CCP operates, and when you start to see the process of grooming of politicians and bureaucrats and business people over some years in the lead up to the signature of the Belt and Road Agreement, you see the CCP very much engaged in this program of political warfare, which is what they call it, targeted at elites in the country in question. And so it's the process of building up to it, and then the way in which, having signed the agreement, and we must always think not in abstractions, governments, institutions, you have to think of individuals. It's always individuals, particular people who are in positions of influence and power. That's how the CCP operates. So they target people and they persuade them that this is very much in their interests, that all of these benefits will flow. Often, you know, many countries are now starting to feel somewhat cheated because the promised material benefits haven't come to the fore in the way they expected. But what we see is the way in which people's attitudes are shifted, the way in which the networks that they develop with people in China and amongst the pro-Beijing diaspora draw them into a certain worldview and set up a series of reciprocities and obligations that essentially turns them into friends of China, which is a very specific Chinese Communist Party term, friends of China.
Yeah, I mean, we have been encouraging for decades Chinese investment in Australia. There is an argument that the material standard of living that we all enjoy today as Australians largely hinges off the back of Chinese investment and Australian exports to China. Is it possible to encourage and benefit from Chinese investment as we have in Australia, where we do have a small pool of capital to invest? Is it possible to benefit from that without compromising our sovereignty?
Well, I hope so. I mean, we should recognise that, first of all, a strong economic relationship with China has been very important to Australia, but we shouldn't exaggerate it. I mean, there are many commentators and bureaucrats and so on who think there's be all and end all, and, you know, without it, you know, we'd be living in the caves. I mean, this is absurd. I mean, you know, China's rapid growth and its reliance on Australian exports has, you know, perhaps, I don't know whether anyone's done the numbers, someone in Treasury should have, perhaps added a 0.5% or 1% to our GDP growth rate over the last 10 or 15 years. So it's not catastrophic it goes, but of course, we all want a sustainable, harmonious economic and political relationship with the People's Republic of China. So, and China depends on us. Let's keep that in mind. There are certain commodities we supply that it really must need. You notice when the ambassador, not far from where I am now, was threatening all kinds of industries in Australia, threats which have now been followed through on. Beijing has never threatened to cut off iron ore exports from Australia. You know, they know which ones they can find alternative suppliers, and they also know which ones will cause maximum political pain. So this is something we talk about in the book. The CCP has this tactic called Yisheng Bijeng, which, for those who speak Mandarin, apologies, which means literally use business to influence government. So they know with a great deal of with certainty who are the crucial lobby groups in Australian industry. They're not necessarily the big obvious ones, but there might be crucial ones in marginal seats, or there might be rural-based ones, and it's the National Party, and they will target those sectors where they know the leaders of them will be screaming most, and immediately get on the phone to ministers, prime ministers, and start pressuring them to back down and be nice to China. This is what Yisheng Beijing is about. Is kind of so when those threats were made by the ambassador, barley beef and a couple of others, we thought, oh, that's terrible. You're going to cause us economic pain. But in fact, the real strategy was the ambassador was sending a message to the leaders and the executives of those particular industries and others who are nervous. You better get on the phone and start lobbying the government, because you guys are the ones that are going to suffer. They know what they're doing.
So, look, we've actually spent a bit of time talking about Australia, despite the fact that your book is mostly not about Australia, actually. It's about Chinese influence in Europe and the United States. There's all manner of countries we could talk about. It's kind of hard to know where to start. Let's look, though, at China exerting its influence in the UK, where you write that it was announced not long ago that a golden era of Sino-British relations was underway. Just give us an idea of what concerns you about the new Chinese-British relationship. Obviously, the City of London is looking to cement its place as the kind of financial capital of Europe, so it's looking for investment. And China is, I suppose, someone that can provide it. What worries you about this?
Well, the CCP has been working on British elites for quite some time, as I intimated in our opening talk about the 48 Group Club, but there are plenty more, and others that are as important. But it also realised that with Brexit some years ago looking like a distinct possibility, this was a fantastic opportunity, because the United Kingdom would be looking for friends elsewhere if it weakened its ties with Europe. And of course, Donald Trump is this great contradiction, because on the one hand, he's the first president to kind of muscle up to China. Previous presidents from George H.W. Bush had been kind of wanting to, but were dissuaded from it by various other forces. Barack Obama was pretty weak, and so Trump muscled up. But at the same time, he's played beautifully into the hands of the CCP strategists by alienating all of his allies, including the United Kingdom, weakening that alliance. And the CCP obviously understands all of this. And so they put a lot of diplomatic and political and business effort into cultivating British elites, to the point where David Cameron was declaring, and indeed Theresa May subsequently, that the two countries had entered into this, love fest, the new golden era of Sino-British relations. And let me tell you a little anecdote about the research into this book. When we started, Marika and I started to work together, I said to her, I'm very interested in Britain. It's a very important part of the story, but I've done a bit of a recce about CCP influence in Britain. And having written Silent Invasion, I know what to look for. And I said, I can't really see very much. And she said, keep looking, there's a lot there. And unlike in Australia, the British media have really not cottoned on to the problem and started to expose it. That's starting to shift in very recent months. And so I did start to look much harder and talk to some people, and boy, did I find some astonishing material on CCP influence there. And of course, most of it, you need Chinese language. You have to go to the Chinese language media in Britain and particularly in China itself. And when you start delving into it, you see that there's been a sustained influence operation directed not just at the political parties, but literally at number 10 Downing Street. You see just what an extraordinary strategy of influence has been carried out in the case of the United Kingdom.
Yep. Okay. Yes. So we were talking about the princelings of Wall Street and their tendency to hiring the sons and daughters basically of China's party leaders.
So the red aristocracy in China, the top Communist Party officials, also have deep links into major corporates in China, with masses of money stashed overseas, as the Panama Papers revealed. Wall Street realised that if they want to get a piece of the promised El Dorado of access to financial markets in China, they needed political contacts. So what they started to do in the early 2000s was to begin to employ the sons and daughters of the red aristocracy, the so-called princelings. And there was a really sustained program, in fact, serious competition between the big Wall Street firms and particularly the international banks. It was happening, as I said, in Frankfurt and London and Zurich. And so what they did is they employed the 22-year-old graduates from usually an American East Coast university, and they gave them good jobs, sinecures and good salaries. And that gave them access to their fathers or sometimes their uncles, who were senior Communist Party officials, who had basically told them, if you employ my son or my daughter, then you will get preferment in your business dealings in China.
I think you say, Clive, that that Credit Suisse hired over 100 sons, daughters and friends of senior government officials. Some of these, you suggest, you write about in the book, are paid $1 million a year and scarcely turn up to work.
Yeah, in the case of one who was rated unsuitable for the job, and once she did turn up, she was rude, unprofessional, and sometimes brought her mother along to the office. But they gave her a raise because her father was powerful and they got business in China. And Credit Suisse was interesting because they were perhaps one of the more systematic companies doing this practice. They had a spreadsheet and they had all the princelings that they employed. And then they kind of kept a record of how many deals and the value of the deals they received. You know, it was kind of a cost-benefit analysis of corruption. And some of it was revealed in an investigation in the US.
You mentioned Donald Trump before, Clive, and obviously China-US relations have soured under Trump. Even before COVID, there was a trade war. The US is sick of the damage that Chinese imports were having on their manufacturing sector. What impact is the US-China tension having on China's presence in the US at the moment, where, you know, for decades they've cultivated important channels of political influence with other US presidents? How would you describe the relationship between China and the US now?
Yes, there's a chapter on how the CCP has cultivated political elites in the United States at a kind of federal level, from presidents down. And then there's one for Europe on the same thing. But we also put a lot of focus on the way the CCP has cultivated elites at state and municipal level as well. But if you look at the relationship between party influence operations and the White House and Congress over the years, you can see a fairly consistent pattern. I should say it's worked far more effectively in Canada over the border than it has in the United States. There have always been certain obstacles of gaining the kind of influence they'd like to have, particularly in the Congress. But within the White House, there have been some extraordinarily effective operations, if you like, particularly in the Clinton administration, of gaining access to the president and top officials. And Trump himself, for all of his pushing back, he does have within his top team some people very kind of sympathetic towards warm relations with China. And in other words, people who put the economics above everything else. So it's a kind of fascinating and complicated story. But particularly in the United States, where it's the alternative superpower, it's far easier in places like Canada and Australia.
Yes, you write about a White House trade advisor who was involved in in Trump's trade against China, war against China, a guy called Peter Navarro, who attacked the so-called globalist billionaires of Wall Street, the bankers and fund managers, who he said were kind of acting as agents of Beijing influence in Washington.
It was an astonishing statement coming out of the White House. An attack on the titans of Wall Street, who he said were undermining Trump's economic and trade war approach to Beijing and the political battle going on. And so I thought, well, how much truth is there in this claim of Navarro that there were these globalist billionaires of Wall Street in order to undermine the US's diplomatic approach? And indeed, there's a powerful amount of evidence suggesting that, yes, indeed, top Chinese leaders, when they go to the United States, will frequently begin their visits with a whole series of meetings with the titans of Wall Street. And the titans of Wall Street will frequently begin putting pressure on the White House and Congress to take a friendly attitude towards Beijing. So the globalist billionaires that Peter Navarro referred to really are operating in the interests of the CCP. And I was having a discussion in Washington with a very senior person. I don't get to talk to many senior people. This is the only one, actually. But I don't want to big note myself. But he said, I think we quote this in the book, that people who like making deals love the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah. So since your book was written, COVID-19, which emerged in China, has become this massively disruptive pandemic. What would you say the impact has been on the fact that China was quite secretive about the coronavirus in the early months, then initially tried to thwart an investigation into it? Has this caused China a great deal of global harm around the world in countries where they had successfully managed to gain some influence?
Yes, it's been a mixed picture. To focus on the areas where Beijing hasn't suffered and in fact may even have gained influence, I'm thinking of Italy, for example. I'm thinking of Central and Eastern Europe. CCP adopts this tactic which it refers to as use the countryside to surround the cities, which came out of the Long March and the warfare, guerrilla warfare in the 30s and 40s. And so the periphery of Europe, CCP managed to gain and continues to have a great deal of influence amongst top political elites. But in some countries, I'm thinking particularly of the United Kingdom, the CCP has suffered a huge amount of damage as a result of not just the COVID-19, but also the Hong Kong situation, which of course is very dear to the hearts of many people in Britain, being a former colony. And the repression there has really lost it a lot of friends, to the point where many senior Tories are now coming out and saying, this is just not right. We don't want to have a golden era with this dictatorship. We must actually resist its influence in Britain. And that goes for undoing the decision, in my view, a disastrous decision by Boris Johnson, and in fact Theresa May before him, of allowing Huawei into Britain's 5G network. Now, as a result of what's happened in recent months, it seems almost certain now that that will not happen, that resistance, if Boris Johnson put it to a vote in the House of Commons, then he would lose. Yeah. And so China, or Beijing, has had a big setback in the UK. And similarly, the story is different everywhere. Germany is absolutely crucial to all of this. And in fact, in a way, if we're thinking about where do we want this book, Hidden Hand, to have the biggest impact, it struck us that Germany is really crucial, because Germany is very much wavering. There's a lot of anti-American sentiment, and who can blame them with Donald Trump in the White House? And there's a huge amount of influence by the CCP among German industry, particularly the auto industry. German car companies, you know, which are a global powerhouse, sell some 50% of their cars in China. And so they want to be friends with Beijing at whatever cost. And they have a lot of influence over Angela Merkel herself and many people in her government. So Germany is very much wavering, and the COVID situation does not seem to have had that bigger impact in Germany. So it's a complex situation.
Yeah. Look, the line is still pretty dodgy, so I'm just going to compress a couple of questions here and then hand back to Chrissy in a moment to fire some audience questions. It's a unfortunately poor line that we've been unfortunately blessed with tonight. But how should the West, given everything you've told us tonight, Clive, how should the West, including Australia, respond to the threat that you say the CCP poses to democracy and freedom and human rights? What does a pushback strategy look like?
Well, for countries like Australia, which aren't engaged in, you know, superpower arm wrestles, our basic task is to protect our institutions from CCP influence, to stop it infiltrating politics, to make sure the business community is more alert to the kind of problems that are there, to make sure that CCP and its agents and agencies aren't influencing the way our universities operate. And so that's why we have new laws, particularly the foreign interference law, which is a world first and which is yet to result in a prosecution, but probably will soon. And many other countries are looking at that. But also the most important thing, I think, Paul, is really to shed light on the whole situation, because the CCP loves to operate in the shadows. And so turning on the lights makes it more difficult. So I think that's the essential message: to be aware, to understand, to pursue friendly relations where possible, but at all costs to resist influence operations and not to succumb to bullying. And I think the Morrison government is taking a very sensible and firm and calm stance in that regard.
Look, I will wrap it up, Clive. Unfortunately, it's not getting any better. It's been great to talk to you, so much, actually, that I wanted to talk to you about, but I will cut this short because it's rather tough to listen to. And I'll hand back to Chrissy. And Chrissy, I just wonder, given the problems we've been having, do you want to fire an audience question or two to Clive, or I'll leave it to you?
Yeah, let's just try a couple. I mean, we can hear a little bit of it, so let's just give it a couple. So there's a question here from Heather, which is that if the CCP is keen to support the arts in the West as a way of influencing our culture, is the government's lack of support and indeed defunding the arts in Australia, especially now during COVID, where we're watching watching the demise of numerous institutions with more to follow, making Australian culture especially vulnerable to CCP influence? And how we'll go with that.
Oh, fantastic question. It's very much like the same kind of problem the universities have faced with defunding and CCP agencies popping up with money. Bottom line is, don't do it. There is always a political agenda with CCP and CCP-linked agencies, always. And so we've seen some really regrettable cases of cultural censorship in the West. The Royal Theatre in Madrid, for example, cancelling performances under pressure from the ambassador, plays being cancelled, films being censored. You just don't do it. It's just not the risk, not worth the risk. I mean, money is one thing, artistic integrity and free speech is another.
Thanks, Clive. I'll just ask another question because we are losing you. I'll just ask one more and then we might go. We might call that a night. It's been really fascinating listening to you tonight. So, are there any NGOs that have been doing what you see as good work in building awareness and resistance to CCP influence in Australia? That's from Edward.
Well, I think the ones that are having a small impact, but I'd love to see them have much more impact. And they are the Chinese-Australian organisations that are independent and haven't fallen under the influence of a CCP or people essentially working on behalf of it. I think it's exceptionally important for us in Australia to hear more Chinese-Australian voices in this debate. And there are plenty of Chinese Australians who would like to participate in it. Unfortunately, only few do, and that's because many are just afraid. And let me tell you a little anecdote. A good friend of mine, Chinese Australian person, told me a few weeks ago that her mother, who lives in China, had died. And she's grieving, but she also said she finally feels free because the CCP can't get at her anymore. And I thought, wow, what a tragedy. Here's an Australian citizen who should be enjoying all the rights to engage in political debate in this country, who has been driven out of and silenced because she's so afraid that her mother will be persecuted if she does. And her mother has now died. And although it's a tragic event for her, she also feels free in a way that she hasn't felt before. So that's the real problem that we have with so many people in the diaspora in this country. They want to be full citizens, but the CCP can extend its influence over them and intimidate and silence them.
Right. Look, this has been the most amazing conversation. And to be honest, I've got some incredibly great questions here, but we do lose bits of your answers. So I think that we're going to have to wrap it up there. I'll turn your video back on again so we can see you. I think, can you turn your own video back on so we can see you, Clive? Yes, there you are. Great. I've had lots of people texting through with standing ovations and saying bravo. We hopefully will be able to cobble something together for Big Ideas with your phone recording that you have beside you. And hopefully we'll get to listen to it in more detail on Big Ideas. It has been my pleasure to host tonight. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Clive, for such a fascinating discussion.
Yep. Thanks for persisting, Clive, and thanks, Chrissy.
Thank
Terrific.
you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. See you later, everybody.
Bye.